Today on Inside the Issues, I speak with Brian Kahin on the issue of the digital economy. Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Inside the Issues, a CIGI online podcast. My name is Dr. Andrew Thompson. I'm an adjunct assistant professor of political science at the University of Waterloo and a senior fellow here at the Centre for International Governance Innovation. Every week, we're joined by an expert in global governance or international public policy here to the studio in Waterloo. Today, my guest is Brian Kahin. He is a visiting scholar at the University of Washington School of Law, a senior fellow at the Computer and Communications Industry Association, and a research affiliate at the MIT Sloan School's Initiative for the Digital Economy. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
So to get our viewers up to speed, can you just explain what is the digital economy?
Well, the digital economy is many things to many people. You can think of it as an aggregate of a lot of different industries, ranging from telecommunications to software to advertising on the web. I prefer to think of it as around the core concepts of digitization and what that means in sort of economic terms and how that sort of radiates into the economy as a whole. So some people also talk of things like the second economy. We used to talk about the new economy. There are various different takes, which does make it rather hard to talk about in a coherent way.
And how is it transforming or affecting the non-digital economy?
Well, it's going to be transforming it more and more. We have what's called the Internet of Things, which is connecting all physical objects that have some sort of intelligence to them to the Internet. So we're only partway through the transformation. Some people talk of the digital technology being a general purpose technology, and general purpose technologies like electricity take some time to evolve and make their significance felt.
Right. And can you maybe give us some examples of how it is changing the way we consume, for instance, or how we invest?
Well, consume, of course, we've changed a lot of the way that we consume content.
Right.
So for many people, digitization actually refers to the movement from analog to digital, the actual transformation of content. But it really is a much broader phenomenon than that, and we shouldn't get stuck on what it means for content. Because content is very familiar. We all watch video, we all listen to podcasts or whatever.
Right.
But it's really more important in terms of what goes on behind the scenes in business processes and industrial processes, and the way we think and assimilate information and knowledge. And it's harder to get a grasp on the latter, but I think those are especially important. That thanks to search, we are able to research things and learn things in a different way than we've been able to do by going to the library and looking up stuff on paper.
And when I think of the digital economy, I think of what people have called disruptive technologies and how this technology really is transforming whole sectors of our economy. Which sectors have been most affected by this? Which ones still are there sectors that have been relatively unchanged?
Sure, I would say that mining perhaps has not been changed that much. I think actually government has not been changed that much, although we do see government interfacing with citizens and businesses in some new ways. Particularly policy has not been affected that much directly, although many people think that that's unfortunate, that it is hard for government to respond to a disruptive technology, in part because we have a mythology that government should be technology neutral.
Okay.
And in my view, technology is not neutral because it does sort of rebalance have fundamental values in ways that are hard to get a hold of and often not sufficient to justify changing the law, at least not right away. So you asked for examples of transformation.
Right.
Well, of course, one of the most conspicuous examples is the smartphone and what that's done to the way we communicate, the way we find things, the way we walk around with our face looking at our hands and so on.
Right. Now, I mean, there are a lot of big kind of governance challenges, ethical challenges that have emerged as a result of the digital economy. And I'm thinking of things like how we balance these new technologies with something like privacy. Can you say a little bit about some of these tensions that we're living with?
Yes, and some of them are, again, very difficult to get hold of. But copyright has many different, privacy, actually, I wanted to say, has many different aspects to it. Are we talking about physical privacy, or are we talking about your credit ratings, your tax return, or so on? And because privacy has so many different facets, it's often hard to have a good focused conversation about it.
Right.
And particularly in the U.S., we've had taken a very different approach to privacy, very situation specific, compared to, say, Europe, where which has taken a very broad brush approach. We also have difficulties with intellectual property, as opposed to, say, for example, competition policy, which is a very sort of top-down. Intellectual property is pervasive. It's a set of regimes that structure private behavior in certain ways, and they do it sort of ubiquitously.
And so just perhaps building on that, what is considered an asset in this new digital economy?
That's a very tough question, because we have a received understanding that assets are things that companies or individuals have complete control over.
Right.
And we now see a lot of manifestations of how things can be, software, for example, can be reused, can be redistributed, can be licensed in a variety of different ways. And so that's a different take on assets. We have the sharing economy, so what have been personal assets, how homes and cars can be put to essentially commercial use by Uber and by Airbnb and so on.
Right.
So it has a lot of implications for assets, and assets have always been important because they give us a clue to what's going on in the economy, where wealth is, who has the wealth, and so on.
My impression of the digital economy, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that it is relatively unregulated. I mean, is that too sweeping a statement? Or is this something where government is actually playing quite a significant role?
Well, government defines, for example, what different intellectual property regimes do.
Right.
And they are quite different, and people tend to get them mixed up. So it regulates at a fine level there, and that has necessarily been transformed to some extent by digitization. There are other areas where the government's role is more on an exceptional basis.
Okay.
Antitrust.
Okay.
Antitrust intervention has to be triggered in certain ways, and it's sort of the exception rather than the rule, whereas privacy and intellectual property are pervasive.
Right. And just getting back to your earlier comment that policy hasn't been affected as much by digitization as other sectors of the economy or other parts of our life. Are there policy areas, though, specific policy areas, I'm thinking something like taxation, that is affected quite dramatically by this phenomenon?
Well, taxation is definitely challenged by it.
Right.
The problem is that governments generally operate in a fairly stovepiped, or siloed manner. So it's difficult to look at digitization as a whole, as a broad-based phenomenon. Now, businesses have to do this all the time,
right,
in order to survive, and they also have the ability, because they have resources, because they're privately owned, have access to capital markets and so on, and must do it, or their rivals will overtake them.
Right.
They have a lot of options in the digital economy. There are new business models. There is an emphasis on achieving scale, even at the expense of short-term profitability. But there is much that businesses can do and have to do to understand digitization.
Right. And I mean, so much of this is transnational. Are states cooperating on these issues around some kind of coherent policy?
To some extent, and of course it varies a lot from issue to issue.
Right.
So on things like cybersecurity, yes, you do see some coordination, although when it gets into what happens in surveillance
right,
and search warrants and stuff like that, then you do see some divergence. And on the, of course, in the global financial system, there is a long tradition of cooperation.
right,
and people don't realize how much the financial system is enabled by digitization. So, that may be an indirect case where governments do coordinate, but they have to do it.
And can you think of maybe one or two areas where there is an absolute gap in our governance of the digital economy, where states just really aren't attuned to what's happening?
Well, the area that I've spent a lot of time with is the patent system.
Okay.
And the patent system is problematic because it operates in different ways in different industry environments, and there's been a real reluctance of government to make sense of those differences. Although I think that is changing probably for the better, because we have standards are very important in the digital environment.
Okay.
And so we have this. This is actually not so much the government, but the private sector organizing, cooperating in order to compete. And standards have become a very important institution for the digital economy. And standards in many areas, like wireless, it often involve a lot of patents.
Okay.
And so there's these understandings, or rather commitments, to license on a fair, reasonable, and non-discriminatory basis have provided a new way of looking at patents that we didn't have before.
Right. And do you see emerging trends within the digitization of the economy that maybe in the next few years may become really big factors in how this process unfolds?
Well, I think the Internet of Things, which depends a lot on standardization and security,
right,
is a very important development, and I would hope that works out. The problem with standardization is it works reasonably well with a relatively small set of players. If you have the technology concentrated in a few companies, and the companies are both implementers and innovators.
right,
But when it comes to things like the smart grid where you have many industries involved, that's where there's more likely to be a role for government in terms of ensuring that people, the different pieces of the economy cooperate.
Brian, this has been absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much for joining us. And thank you to our audience. Please join us again for another episode of Inside the Issues, a CIGI Online podcast. Look for us online at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on YouTube, and on Twitter.